The package that arrived just before I left for Port Blossom wasn't a package at all. It was a single, flimsy jewel case in a bubble wrap mailer. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a futuristic, sterile CD-ROM. Scrawled across its silvery surface in Caleb's familiar Sharpie scrawl was Saltwater Playlist, the Y2K bug-out mix. "It's the future, Leo," he'd declared over the phone last week, the screech of his 56K modem a shrieking third wheel in our conversation. 100 songs, 128 kbps bitrate. It's perfect. "It's compressed, Cal," I'd shot back, the music snob in me flaring up. "It's music recorded in a tin can. Give me the warm hiss of analog any day. Give me a TDK cassette you have to flip over halfway through." We'd been having this argument for months, ever since he'd started hoarding MP3s like a digital dragon. To me, his playlists were sacred artifacts. The first one, from the summer of '93, was a beautiful mess of Pavement, The Breeders, and Two Princes by the Spin Doctors, because we weren't cowards. He'd hand-drawn the cover. An MP3 folder just felt soulless. "Look," he'd said, his voice dropping into the deadpan tone he used when he was about to be insufferably nerdy. "When every computer on Earth melts at the stroke of midnight this New Year's, this disc might be all that's left. This is our Rosetta Stone, man, our legacy." I'd rolled my eyes, but I was smiling. That was us. Now, sitting in the chaotic mess of our spring break rental house, the disc felt like an anchor. Our friends were already shotgunning beers in the living room to a soundtrack of whatever was on MTV. But in my hand, I held the real soundtrack. I walked past the party, slid the back door open, and stepped onto the porch, the salty air a welcome relief. This required headphones. This required focus. This was our ritual. I found a semi-quiet corner on the back porch, popping the flimsy latch on my trusty Sony Discman. I was ready for the ritual. I took out Caleb's CD-ROM, its silvery surface catching the afternoon sun, and went to place it on the spindle. It didn't fit. Of course it didn't fit. This wasn't an audio CD. It was a data disc, full of his precious compressed MP3 files. My Discman, a loyal companion that had survived countless road trips and mosh pits, looked at the disc like it was an alien artifact. It couldn't read it. "Son of a," I muttered. To listen to Caleb's futuristic masterpiece, I'd have to use a computer. I stormed back inside, navigating a minefield of empty beer bottles and discarded flip-flops, and found the rental house's communal PC. It was a beige gateway tower humming loudly in the corner, a dusty monument to 90s technology. Mark was sitting in front of it, patiently waiting for a picture of some B-list actress to load over a dial-up connection that was slower than continental drift. "Get off," I said, nudging him out of the chair. "Official spring break business." After a brief argument and the promise of a beer, the computer was mine. I slid the CD-ROM in, the drive whirred and groaned, and after a moment that felt like an eternity, a folder popped up. Y2K Bug-Out Mix. I plugged in my headphones, clicked the first track, and leaned back. The opening chords of "Steal My Sunshine" filled my ears, and I smiled. Okay, we're on familiar ground. Third Eye Blind followed. Perfect. This was the stuff of sun-drenched, youthful idiocy. Then track 5 hit. Jeff Buckley's Lover, You Shoulda Come Over. The 7-minute epic of pure, unfiltered heartache. The vibe in my headphones screeched to a halt. It was beautiful, sure, but it was also the sonic equivalent of a rain cloud at a bitch party. Then came Elliott Smith, whispering sweet, depressing nothings in my ear. Then Mazzy Star. My mouse cursor hovered over the chunky next button on the Winamp player. This wasn't a party mix. The flow was all wrong. And that's when it hit me. A lightning bolt of glorious, nerdy clarity. I looked at the folder name again. Y2K Bug-Out Mix. "Oh," I said aloud to the empty corner. "Oh, I get it." This wasn't a playlist. It was an arc. Caleb wasn't trying to create a vibe. He was trying to save a civilization. Our civilization. He was Noah, and this disc was his vessel, loaded with two of every kind of 90s musical animal. The sun-bleached pop rockers, the angst-ridden grunge poets, the critically acclaimed sad bastard singer-songwriters, the one-hit wonders. He wasn't being sappy, he was being an archivist. This was his definitive document of our decade, designed to survive the impending technological apocalypse. The jarring tonal shifts weren't a mistake, they were a feature. He was preserving the entire musical ecosystem. A wave of smug, affectionate pride washed over me. Of course that's what this was. It was the most Caleb thing Caleb had ever done. He was too brilliant, too ridiculously over-analytical to just make a simple party mix. He had to make a grand, conceptual statement about preserving art in the face of oblivion. I didn't just close Winamp, I ejected the CD-ROM, a brilliant, bombastic idea forming in my head. I looked out the window at the party raging on the beach, at the chaotic, beautiful, dumb energy of it all. This wasn't a dusty museum piece to be analyzed in a corner. This was a statement. This was the perfect soundtrack for the last spring break of the 90s, the last one of the millennium. It was a time capsule we could live in. I grinned, feeling like I had just cracked a secret code. Caleb wasn't just a curator, he was a prophet, and I was going to be the DJ who brought his masterpiece to the masses. My first act as the newly self-appointed minister of spring break culture was to find Caleb. He was on the porch, staring out at the ocean. I slapped the CD-ROM case into his hand. "Dude, your playlist isn't a museum," I declared, beaming. "It's a prophecy. It's the official soundtrack for the end of the world as we know it. This is what we're listening to. All week, exclusively." He blinked, looking from the disc back to my face. I expected him to be thrilled at my brilliant insight. Instead, he hesitated. A flicker of something I couldn't read. Panic? Regret? Crossed his face before he masked it. "I don't know, man. It's kinda personal," he said, his voice quiet. I laughed, punching his shoulder. "Of course it's personal. That's what makes it genius. Don't be a possessive music snob. Art is for the people." I was so wrapped up in my grand vision that I completely missed the strained look on his face. He forced a smile, a flicker of something sad and knowing in his eyes. "If you say so, Leo," he said, his voice laced with a dry irony I completely missed. "You're the one who always writes the reviews." "Exactly," I said, oblivious. "Okay, so how do we make this thing portable?" That's when he produced his trump card, though it felt less like a triumphant reveal than a reluctant concession. It was a Discman, but a thick, clunky, futuristic-looking thing. On the lid next to the familiar Sony logo were 3 letters that changed everything. MP3. "No way," I said, stopping mid-stuff. "You actually bought one?" "Cost a fortune, battery life is terrible, but it holds the key to our entire digital future." "It's a glorified calculator, Cal," I scoffed, "and now you can bring your sad bastard symphonies out into the sunshine to harsh everyone's mellow. Great!" He just grinned, plugging a cable from the headphone jack into the back of his massive boombox. And just like that, the Y2K bug-out mix was portable. The Arc was now an all-terrain vehicle, and Caleb was the designated and very protective driver. It became the default soundtrack for the week's debauchery, and for the most part, my archivist theory held up. Blasting Super Drag while tossing a football on the sand made sense. Harvey Danger on the drive to the boardwalk was perfect. The Proddy songs were doing their job. But the other songs, the quiet ones, would inevitably surface on shuffle. We were on the beach that evening, a full-blown party raging around a sputtering bonfire. The boombox was perched on a cooler, and Caleb's MP3 Discman was plugged into it. Then, the shuffle landed on Fade Into You by Mazzy Star. The dreamy, slow-burn guitar riff cut through the party noise like a fog, completely killing the vibe. "What is this sad crap?" yelled Mark, a beer-wielding barbarian from the next room. "Boring! Skip it! Put on some Blink 182. He lunged for the boombox, his sights set on the next button. Yeah, skip, another voice chimed in. My first instinct was to agree, but then I saw Caleb's face, and I couldn't do it. I stepped in front of the boombox, holding up a hand like a traffic cop. Nobody touches the boombox, I announced, my voice a little too loud. Mark stared at me. This isn't a song, I said with utter, unblinking seriousness. It's a palate cleanser. You can't appreciate the sublime stupidity of the pop-punk that's coming next without this moment of quiet dread. It's essential to the integrity of the exhibit. Don't question the curator. It was a ridiculous, nerdy, and completely insane defense. But it worked. Mark, utterly bewildered, just shrugged and stumbled back to the keg. The song played out in its entirety. 4 minutes of awkward, quiet space in the middle of a rager. Most people ignored it, but I felt Caleb's eyes on me the whole time. When the last note faded, he gave me a small, grateful smile that was so intense, it hit me like a physical shock. It wasn't just gratitude, it was open and warm and aimed directly at me. My stomach didn't just flip, it felt like it was unmoored. A strange, dizzying warmth spreading through my chest. It was a feeling I absolutely did not know what to do with. I brushed it off because I had to, grabbing a beer and loudly demanding the next song be something we could all scream along to. But the memory of that smile lingered, unsettling and annoyingly pleasant. My Y2K museum theory was a masterpiece of self-delusion, and it held up beautifully for most of the week. I felt smart. I felt in on a joke only I could understand. Then, on a lazy, hungover afternoon, the shuffle algorithm on Caleb's MP3 player decided to burn my entire theory to the ground. Track 82. There is a light that never goes out. The Smiths. I froze. My internal fact checker went into overdrive. Released 1986. It wasn't a 90s song. It was the only non-90s song on the entire 100-track list. The rule was broken. My whole elaborate, beautiful, logical explanation for the playlist's weirdness had a gaping, Morrissey-shaped hole in it. The meticulous curator had, for some reason, included a glaring anachronism in his otherwise perfect exhibit. And it just so happened to be that song. We'd worshipped the Smiths in high school, but with a thick layer of protective irony. There Is a Light That Never Goes Out was our go-to anthem for melodramatic nonsense. Got a bad grade? To die by your side is such a heavenly way to die. The pizza place was closed? Oh, take me out tonight. It was our joke. But here, on this playlist, stripped of its 90s context and our teenage irony, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a confession smuggled across a border. Why this song? Why break the rule for this one? I had to know. I couldn't let it go. This wasn't about feelings. This was about a flaw in the curation. I had to call him on it. We were sprawled on the living room floor, recovering, the playlist humming from the boombox. I sat up, trying to sound casual, like a critic finding a minor error in a brilliant film. Okay, Mr. Curator, I have a question about your exhibit. Caleb opened one eye. Shoot. The Smiths, great band, seminal. But 1986, I said, letting the date hang in the air. It's a glaring anachronism in your otherwise meticulously curated 90s museum. It breaks the entire premise of the bug-out mix. So why is it here? I watched him. There it was, the tell, a faint blush creeping up his neck. He wouldn't look at me. I pushed, my voice still light, still joking, mostly. And of all the 80 songs you could have picked, you chose the most dramatic, hard-on-your-sleeve anthem of all time. Kinda undermines your whole detached archivist vibe, don't you think? He sat up, refusing to meet my gaze, and started fiddling with a loose thread on the rug. The silence stretched. Maybe its purpose isn't to be archival, he mumbled, his voice so quiet it was almost swallowed by the music. He finally looked at me, his expression stripped of all irony, all pretense. Maybe its purpose isn't a joke. He pushed himself up to leave, and as he did, He put a hand on my shoulder to steady himself. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it lingered for a fraction of a second too long, a small pocket of warmth and weight that I felt long after he'd walked out of the room. It was an anchor in a suddenly churning sea. My carefully constructed theory didn't just crack, it exploded. And in the ringing silence of my own shattered ego, a terrifying new thought rushed in. If it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a museum, then what was it? My mind instinctively recoiled from the answer, from the implication of that raw look on his face, from the memory of that touch. It was a letter, but not any letter. It was a letter addressed to me, and the sudden, terrifying possibility of what it might say left me feeling completely exposed. The last night of spring break felt like the last day of summer camp, a frantic energy mixed with a creeping sadness. Our final bonfire on Miller's Point was the epicenter of this feeling, a chaotic wake for our week of irresponsibility. The party was thinning, the keg was floating, and the dying embers hissed every time a rogue wave watched too close. Caleb's Jeep was parked near the dunes, the open doors spilling the sounds of the Saltwater playlist into the night. It was the ghost at our feast. I'd been drinking just enough to feel brave. The revelation from that afternoon was a buzzing, agitated coil in my chest. I couldn't go back home with this hanging between us. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen the flaw in the code, the ghost in the machine. Then, as if summoned by my anxiety, the shuffle function on Caleb's Discman worked its terrible magic. The melancholy, iconic opening riff of There Is a Light That Never Goes Out began to drift from the Jeep's speakers. The song silenced the remaining chatter. In the flickering orange light, I saw Caleb freeze, his gaze fixed on the fire. His carefully constructed wall of playful irony was gone, leaving him looking unguarded and achingly vulnerable. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. "Okay, dude, seriously," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. The half-dozen people left looked up. I stood up, the sand unsteady beneath my feet, and walked around the fire until I was standing in front of him. The whole world seemed to shrink to the space between us, the sound of Morrissey's crooning and the crackle of the fire. "Plus," I pressed, my voice a raw mix of frustration and something that felt dangerously like fear. "What are you trying to say, Cal? With this song, with this whole playlist? Because it feels like you're trying to say something, and you're just hoping I'm smart enough to figure it out, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm the biggest idiot on the planet." I took a breath. "So just say it." He stared at me, his face a battleground of terror and what looked like a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. The song's most famous lyric hung in the air between us. "To die by your side is such a heavenly way to die." He finally broke the silence, his voice cracking just once. "I've been saying it, Leo." He shook his head, a sad, bewildered smile on his face. "I've been saying it on every tape since '93. B-sides, hidden tracks, the last song on side A. I've been screaming it for 10 years. He looked me right in the eye and the world tilted. The playful smirk was gone, replaced by a decade of sincerity. "You just never listened to the lyrics." The foundation of my world didn't just crack, it turned to dust. A tidal wave of memories crashed over me, all of them instantly, painfully recontextualized. A heartbreaking acoustic track tucked away on a grunge-heavy cassette. An achingly beautiful love song I had always skipped on a CD from '97. Every quiet, sappy song I had ever mocked or dismissed was a sentence in a letter I had been reading for a decade without ever understanding the words. He hadn't broken the rule of his playlist. The rule was never the '90s. The rule was him. The rule was us. The bonfire died out, and the party evaporated into the pre-dawn mist. I stumbled back to the rental house in a daze, Caleb's words on a relentless loop in my head. You just never listened to the lyrics. The next morning was a cacophony of hungover chaos. People were frantically packing, arguing over who owned which towel, and chugging Pedialyte. The party was officially, brutally over. It was the perfect cover. I could be busy. I could be helpful. I could be anywhere Caleb wasn't. I saw him once, a fleeting glimpse across the wreckage of the living room, his expression drawn and tired. I immediately turned and started aggressively sweeping a patch of floor that was already clean. The drive home was 8 hours of self-flagellation. Mark was passed out in the passenger seat. His snores were a pathetic counterpoint to the raging monologue in my skull. How had I been so blind? My whole theory about the playlist? I felt my face burn with shame. I hadn't just missed the point. I had invented a ridiculously pretentious one to make myself feel smart. All the times I had teased him about his sappy taste, all the times I had deflected with a dumb joke. Each memory was a fresh stab of guilt. When I finally got home, I didn't even unpack my car. I walked straight to my closet and pulled out the dusty shoebox labeled Caleb's Mixes. I sat on my bedroom floor and opened it. It was all there, a history of our friendship in plastic and magnetic tape.
I pulled out the cassette from '95, the one he'd titled Music to Procrastinate To. I scanned the tiny hand-scrawled J-card. And there it was, the last song on side A B-side from a band I barely remembered, You're the Only One I Know. I dug out the CD from '97. Tucked at the very end, after a string of upbeat Britpop anthems, was a song I'd always skipped, Beth Orton's She Cries Your Name. I had thought it was just a boring, slow track. Now, the title alone felt like an accusation. I spent hours like that, surrounded by a decade of unheard confessions. The initial crushing wave of guilt was real. I had been arrogant and blind. But as I sat there tracing the faded ink on a J-card from '95, a different feeling began to surface, something deeper than shame. I wasn't just seeing his story, I was seeing mine. For every quiet, yearning song he had chosen, I could remember my own actions. I remembered choosing to spend that rainy afternoon with him listening to music instead of going to a party. I remembered the fierce, protective surge I felt when anyone made fun of his nerdy passion. I remembered that every summer, the first person I wanted to see was him. My loyalty, my constant gravitational pull toward him, my absolute need for his presence in my life, I'd always called it friendship. It was the safest, easiest word. But looking at this mountain of evidence, I had to wonder if it was the right one. The angst wasn't just about my ignorance anymore. It was the terrifying, thrilling, world-altering realization that for 10 years, he had been writing love songs, and I, in my own clumsy, clueless way, had been singing along. The answer couldn't be words. Words were my clumsy, inadequate tools. I'd proven that for 10 years straight. If I was going to say anything back, I had to say it in his language. I had to make him a playlist. It took me a full week. A week of frantic, obsessive work. A week of sitting on my bedroom floor surrounded by jewel cases and old J-cards, mapping out my side of our story. I wasn't just picking songs, I was building an argument, an apology, and a fragile, hopeful question, all on a 74-minute CD-ROM mix. I started it with Cut Your Hair by Pavement, the song that was blasting from the jukebox the night we first met at a dive bar, both of us underage and terrified. I followed it with the cheesy B-52s track we'd absolutely butchered at karaoke 2 summers ago. I found a blistering live version of a super drag song from a concert we'd driven 6 hours to see, the roar of the crowd a perfect snapshot of that sweaty, euphoric night. This was my evidence. I was there. I remember it all. It meant something to me too. Then came the hard part. The response. I couldn't just load it up with love songs. It would feel like a lie. I was still reeling, still processing. So I chose quieter things. A somber instrumental track by Tortoise, a song by Belle and Sebastian about the terrifying, thrilling prospect of starting something new. It was my way of saying, I hear you. I'm scared out of my mind, but I'm not running away. And then I added one more, slotting it right before the final track, Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. It was a song so overplayed on the radio that we'd both ironically dismissed it, but I knew Caleb secretly loved the raw emotion of it. Stripped of its radio hit status and placed on this intensely personal mix, it was impossible to ignore the lyrics. The soaring, desperate chorus was everything I couldn't say. I just want you to know who I am. It wasn't a memory, it was a request. The night I finished burning it, my hand was shaking as I dialed his number. He answered on the first ring. Caleb, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Check your doorstep in 2 minutes. And don't open it. Just get in your car and drive to the overlook. I hung up before he could answer. I beat him there, parking at the edge of the cliff where we'd watched a meteor shower when we were 17. When his familiar headlights cut through the darkness, my heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. He got out of his car and walked over, holding the CD case. On the plain white insert, I'd simply written, "The B-side." He slid into the passenger seat, the silence between us so heavy I could feel it pressing on my skin. Just listen, I said. I hit play, and as the familiar opening chords of Pavement filled the car, I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then a small, sad smile. He didn't speak, he just listened as I presented my case, track by track. I watched his face in the dim glow of the dashboard, seeing him recognize each memory, each shared joke. When my quiet, tentative answer tracks played, he looked down at the CD case in his lap, his fingers tracing the title. Finally, the last song began. It was Bop, but it wasn't the chirpy, infectious Hanson version we'd spent years mercilessly ridiculing. It was a slow, mournful, achingly beautiful acoustic cover I'd found on some obscure import single. Stripped of its bubblegum production, the song was revealed for what it truly was. A sad, poignant ballad about the terror of time passing, about holding on to the people who truly matter before they fade away. It was our dumbest joke reframed as the most sincere, heartfelt thing I could possibly say. The last chord faded, leaving a ringing silence broken only by the hum of the engine. I turned to him. Guess I finally learned how to listen. Caleb looked up, his eyes shining. He let out a shaky breath that sounded like a decade of waiting. It's about time, he whispered. He leaned across the console, and under the soft green light of the stereo, he closed the distance between us. The kiss was quiet and tentative, and it felt less like a beginning and more like a conversation we should have started a long, long time ago. The next playlist we made together. It wasn't for a vacation, it was for the beginning of everything else. We were on the floor of his apartment the following weekend, and Caleb was in his element, the digital dragon back in his lair. A glowing computer monitor reflected in his eyes, He had a Winamp playlist editor open with what looked like 300 songs already loaded. Okay, so after the acoustic Hanson track, we can flow into the complete discography of the replacements, and then maybe a deep dive into early REM B-sides. I held up my hand, stopping him. In it, I held a single, pristine, blank CDR. 74 minutes, Dragon Boy, I said, tapping the disc. That's the canvas. He looked at me genuinely confused. But we don't need limits anymore, Leo. This is the future. We can have it all. No, I said, my voice softer than I expected. We spent 10 years with 100 unplayed songs between us, 100 different possibilities, all just sitting there. I don't want that anymore. I looked from the disc to him. I just want one playlist. The one that counts. Less songs, more us. He stared at me for a long moment, the manic energy draining from his face replaced by a look of profound understanding. He reached out, deleted the entire 300-song queue from Winamp, and then turned back to me. He looked at me, his eyes full of a quiet awe. Okay, so what's track 1? The question wasn't about the music anymore. It was about what came next. For us. So I gave him an answer without words. I leaned across the space between us, and the kiss that followed was no longer tentative. It was a confirmation, a promise. It was the first note of a song we were finally writing together. When we pulled apart, he was smiling, a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Deal," he said, his voice thick with emotion. And so we chose the notes that would follow. We built the rest of the playlist, track by track, a meticulous, joyful argument over every precious minute. That night, driving nowhere in particular, we listened to it for the first time. The yearning, the friendship, the jokes, the kiss, it was all there, every second earned. I looked over at him, his hand resting on my knee, his face illuminated by the soft green glow of the stereo, and I realized this was the first playlist of his I had ever truly heard. Every summer, he composed a love letter out of music tracks, but from now on, the sound will be our joined heartbeats.